Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It was upon a particularly dreary evening in late November that I found myself seated across from my singular friend, Sherlock Holmes, within the familiar confines of 221B Baker Street. A heavy fog curled against the windows like a living thing, muting the distant rattle of hansom cabs and the mournful cry of a river steamer somewhere on the Thames. Holmes reclined languidly in his chair, fingers steepled, eyes half-lidded, while the faint hiss of the gas lamp illuminated the impatience on his face. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and that peculiar sense of restless dissatisfaction which descended upon Holmes whenever his intellect lay dormant for too long. I had long since abandoned any hope of conversation, for his mood was plain. Unless some matter of intrigue crossed our threshold soon, I feared Holmes might turn to his chemical experiments, always a troubling prospect. To occupy himself, Holmes had taken up my most recent manuscript, a dry study on rare poisons, which I had foolishly left on the table. "This passage on belladonna, Watson, positively soporific," he remarked, his voice dripping with amused cruelty. "I had no idea you possessed such a gift for inducing sleep." "I should think," I replied, bristling, "that the subject might prove valuable should you ever encounter an assassin with a botanical bent." Holmes merely smiled, and to my increasing irritation, reached for his violin. "I wonder," he mused, "whether a dash of Paganini might enliven your text." Before I could formulate a suitable retort, the sound of hurried steps upon the stair broke the exchange, an interruption which Holmes welcomed with visible relief. The footfalls paused outside our door, uncertain, hesitant, before a single sharp knock rang out. Holmes, suddenly alive with purpose, sprang to his feet. "At last," he declared, "the world awakens." With a swift motion, he threw open the door to reveal a figure standing just beyond the threshold. The light from our fire flickered across wet fabric and trembling hands. "Come in," said Holmes, his voice suddenly softened. "It appears fortune has favoured us, Watson. Adventure stands upon our doorstep." The visitor stepped into the room, and as she drew back her hood, I could see the sheen of rain upon her cloak, her hands clasped tightly at her waist. A veil, dark and impenetrable, concealed her features, and though she shivered slightly, she made no move to remove it. Holmes gestured toward the armchair nearest the fire. "You are cold, madam. Pray, sit. We are at your service." Her voice, when she spoke, was low and hurried, her words tumbling over one another like water over stone. I must ask for your discretion, Mr. Holmes. My situation is delicate." As she raised her hand to brush back a stray lock of hair, Holmes's gaze flicked toward her gloves. I saw nothing unusual, but Holmes's brows arched almost imperceptibly. The gloves were too large, their edges frayed, as though borrowed in haste. More curious still was her voice. Cultured, certainly, but with a fleeting undercurrent of something rougher, less polished. Holmes, of course, said nothing of his observations, merely motioning for me to prepare my notebook. "Let us begin," he said. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his nostrils flaring almost imperceptibly. "Interesting," he murmured, so softly I thought I had misheard him. There was, indeed, something peculiar in the air. A faint tang, sharp and briny, like a memory of the sea. It clung to the folds of the woman's cloak, mingling with the scent of damp wool and cheap perfume. Holmes's fingers tapped once upon his knee, the gesture almost one of satisfaction. "My name," said our visitor at last, her voice soft yet uncertain, "is Genevieve Harcourt. I am employed as companion to Lady Agatha Saint, Clare of Deverell House." Holmes gave the slightest nod. his fingers steepled beneath his chin. A house of some reputation, if memory serves, he remarked. Lady Agatha, if I am not mistaken, is a collector of no small ambition when it comes to rare jewels. A flicker passed across Miss Harcourt's veiled face, whether relief or apprehension, I could not yet say. It is precisely her collection that brings me here, she continued. 2 nights ago, the most valuable piece of all, the Black Pearl of Taranto, vanished from her locked jewel case. The house was secured, the windows fastened, and not a servant stirred after midnight. And yet, the pearl was gone. Holmes's eyes brightened. A locked room mystery, Watson. How very refreshing. Miss Harcourt's gloved hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the tale. The Black Pearl, she explained, was acquired by Lady Agatha's late husband under rather curious circumstances. It had passed through a series of unfortunate owners, each meeting some sudden misfortune, shipwreck, bankruptcy, even murder. Lady Agatha, however, scoffed at such tales and placed the pearl in her collection under lock and key. And yet, said Holmes, superstition has a talent for seeping through even the stoutest locks. Miss Harcourt nodded. 2 nights ago, Lady Agatha retired as usual. I myself ensured the jewel case was secure. Yet by morning the pearl had vanished, though the lock was undisturbed. No window was forced, no door unbolted. Holmes's fingers drummed a rapid rhythm upon the arm of his chair. A thief with a gentle touch, or something altogether stranger. What of the household staff? None had access to the room, she replied. Lady Agatha guards her treasures obsessively. A fortress in miniature, Holmes mused. And yet the pearl is gone. I glanced at Holmes, recognizing that gleam in his eye which always accompanied the scent of an unusual puzzle. There is something more, Miss Harcourt added, lowering her voice. A series of letters arrived in the weeks before the theft, anonymous, crude, and each bearing the same message. Holmes leaned forward. The content? They warned, she said, her voice faltering, that the pearl belonged to the dead, that it had been reclaimed once before and would be taken again by the hand of the sea. Delightful, murmured Holmes, with an enthusiasm that seemed quite out of place under the circumstances. The sea, I repeated, puzzled. The pearl was once part of a pirate's hoard, said to have been lost at sea before it was salvaged by a distant ancestor of Lady Agatha's late husband. A legend marinated in salt water, Holmes observed, and no doubt carefully embroidered over the years. Miss Harcourt clasped her hands tightly. Lady Agatha is a practical woman, but even she grew uneasy after the 3rd letter. The theft, following so soon after, sealed the superstition into fact, Holmes finished for her. Throughout this account, I had been absorbed in the tale, but Holmes's attention rested elsewhere. His gaze travelled, never rudely, but with a thoroughness I knew well, from Miss Harcourt's shoes to the clasp of her veil, lingering at her hands. You have been writing this morning, he observed, with a pen of poor quality, ink of a slightly purplish hue, I would wager. She started. How could you possibly know that? Holmes offered a faint smile. Your gloves, Miss Harcourt. The ink smudge upon your right thumb is quite unmistakable. I shook my head, accustomed as I was to such feats. Is that relevant? I asked. Holmes did not reply. Frayed at the hem, Holmes murmured, almost to himself, as Miss Harcourt adjusted her skirt. A garment that once belonged to someone taller than yourself. He turned slightly, his eyes noting the faintest mark encircling her left wrist, a rawness that suggested a bracelet or cuff had been worn too tightly and too long. You handled the pearl yourself, he said quietly, but made no further remark. Watson, as ever, missed this particular whisper of deduction. Once Miss Harcourt had concluded her account, Holmes sat back with a satisfied sigh. It has all the elements, Watson. An ancient curse, a vanished jewel, spectral hands reaching from the sea. If one must have a theft, at least let it have flair. You mean to suggest, I began, that the supernatural element is mere decoration? Holmes raised a brow. My dear Watson, the supernatural has one fatal flaw. It always leaves fingerprints. There will be nothing ethereal about this particular culprit, I assure you. Holmes leaned back, fingers forming that familiar steeple, his gaze fixed not on Miss Harcourt, but on some distant point, visible only to himself. Interesting, was all he said. I have learned, in my long association with Holmes, that such moments mark the birth of his finest deductions. What precisely had caught his attention, I could not yet fathom. But that the case was already half solved in his mind, I had no doubt. To my irritation, he said no more. I believe a visit to Lady Agatha's estate is in order, said Holmes at last, rising abruptly. First light, Watson. Bring your revolver and your patience. Do you expect danger? I asked. Not at all, he replied with a maddening smile. But I do expect entertainment. The morning was crisp, and a thin mist clung to the cobbles as our hansom rattled toward the waterfront. Holmes sat beside me in silence, his sharp profile angled toward the window, fingers steepled in contemplation. I knew better than to disturb his thoughts, and so we rode in quiet, the distant toll of a ship's bell mingling with the creak of rigging from unseen masts. Deverell House stood at the edge of the docks, where the river mist curled around its weathered facade like a ghostly veil. The very air seemed steeped in brine, and the tang of salt water clung to the iron gate as Holmes pushed it open. Maritime legends and locked-room mysteries, Watson, he said, with a faint smile. A setting most congenial. And a client half drowned in superstition, I muttered, but Holmes's smile only broadened as we crossed the threshold. Lady Agatha Street Clare received us in a dimly lit parlour, its curtains drawn despite the daylight outside. She was a woman of advanced years, her once aristocratic features softened by age and shadowed by unmistakable fear. Around her neck hung a string of beads, half religious, half talismanic, and her fingers nervously traced the edges of a small charm, a corroded sliver of metal shaped like an anchor. My lady, Holmes began with the politeness he reserved for the truly terrified. Miss Harcourt has acquainted us with the circumstances, but I would prefer to hear it directly from you. Her voice trembled as she spoke of the pearl, her fingers clutching the charm with each mention of the theft. The threatening letters, the whispers of ghostly hands reaching from the sea, had left their mark on her nerves. You do not believe in these visitations? I asked, more to reassure her than myself. I believe in logic, my dear Watson, Holmes said quietly. But even logic cannot work in darkness. Let us shed some light upon this house. Lady Agatha, muttering a brief prayer to St. Nicholas of Sailors, led us toward the heart of the matter. As Lady Agatha conducted us through the house, I could not help but notice how the very walls seemed steeped in some unspoken history. The air held the faint scent of salt and old wood, as though the sea itself had taken up residence within. The first servant we encountered was a valet, his sleeves rolled to reveal forearms inked with crude tattoos, anchors, mermaids, and a name long since blurred by time. His wary glance toward Holmes suggested a man who had seen his share of trouble and preferred to avoid more. Next came Mrs. Egerton, the housekeeper, her hands folded tightly before her, her lips pressed into a thin line. There was something in her eyes, a guarded grief, that Holmes marked at once. When he inquired, she reluctantly spoke of her son, lost at sea years before, the very night the pearl had first arrived at Deverell House. It was a cursed thing from the start, she whispered, before catching herself and hurrying away. Holmes paused only briefly before proceeding. Every house has its ghosts, Watson. The trick is determining which are flesh and blood. We entered the drawing room where the theft had occurred. As Holmes examined the locked jewel case, his attention shifted almost imperceptibly to the valet standing nearby. I might have missed the moment entirely had I not seen Holmes's gaze drop to the man's shoes, polished to a fine shine, yet curiously uneven. "Your debts are mounting, I see," Holmes remarked conversationally. The valet's face blanched. I beg your pardon, sir?" The trembling hand when you poured the brandy, the scuffed heel indicating hurried pacing, and the polish, applied with more vigour than precision, suggesting the nervous habit of a man who hopes to make a good impression before a creditor calls. The valet stammered denials, but Holmes waved them away. "Your secrets are of no interest to me, unless of course they pertain to pearls." He turned to me with a faint smile. "A household's minor sins, Watson, are often the most illuminating." The tale of the Black Pearl of Taranto, as recounted by Lady Agatha herself, possessed all the hallmarks of those peculiar relics which seem to gather tragedy as effortlessly as they gather dust. "It was no ordinary gem," Lady Agatha said, her voice low and tremulous. "It lay for centuries in the hoard of the pirate Vasco di Taranto, reputed to have plucked it from the crown of a Moorish prince. The pearl was said to have been paid for in blood at every handover since." Holmes listened with polite detachment, though I detected the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth. "And how did it come to reside at Deverell House?" "My husband acquired it at auction some 20 years ago," she explained. "It had been salvaged from a shipwreck off the coast of Cornwall. The vessel's entire crew perished in the storm. A history well marinated in misfortune," Holmes remarked. Lady Agatha fingered her charm once more. "That pearl has brought nothing but sorrow to those who've held it. And now it has vanished," Holmes said softly, "and taken its curse with it." Holmes examined the jewel case with his characteristic thoroughness, beginning not with the lock itself, but with the case's hinges, the inner lining, and even the polish upon its surface. "Curious," he murmured. "You observe, Watson, that the velvet here is disturbed, as though something heavier than the pearl itself rested within." I could see nothing out of the ordinary, but I had long since learned that Holmes's eye inhabited a world altogether different from my own. He moved next to the window, his gaze tracing the frame with care. "No sign of forced entry," he remarked, "yet it is always wise to distrust appearances." With a magnifying glass produced from his pocket, he scanned the latch, the sill, and even the outer stone ledge, his movements swift and confident. "And the lock upon the case?" I asked. "A mechanism of respectable workmanship," he said. "No evidence of tampering, unless, of course, the thief possessed the key." Lady Agatha's face paled at the implication, but Holmes had already moved on, his attention now fixed upon a tiny smudge upon the window frame. Holmes ran a gloved fingertip along the faint smudge, then held it to the light. A thin, crystalline residue clung to the leather, a grainy film that caught the morning sun. "Salt," he said, almost to himself. "And yet the weather report confirms no rain upon the night in question." He turned to Lady Agatha. "Does anyone within the household make regular excursions to the waterfront?" "Certainly not," she replied, puzzled. Holmes glanced back at the window, his expression unreadable. "The logical conclusion, therefore, is that someone brought the sea into the house." I stared at him. "You mean—" "Precisely, Watson. Our visitor, whoever they were, came soaked in seawater, leaving the smallest trace of their passing behind them." "But if the windows were locked—" "An illusion of security," Holmes said. "I dare say I shall uncover a less orthodox means of entry upon closer inspection." Watson, baffled as ever, followed as Holmes crossed back to the jewel case, muttering quietly about salt, locks, and invisible hands. As we prepared to depart, Holmes adjusted his gloves and cast me a sidelong glance, one I knew well. It was the look he gave when the shape of a case had already begun to form in his mind, though the details remained just out of reach. "You have something, Holmes?" I asked. "A shadow, Watson," he replied, "and with any luck, that shadow will soon take shape." We left Deverell House with the tide retreating at our backs, and a mystery far more peculiar than even Lady Agatha had imagined gathering around us like the morning mist. It was on our second evening at Deverell House, after a day spent in quiet observation, that Holmes finally chose to speak, not to Lady Agatha, but directly to Miss Harcourt, who sat stiffly by the window with hands folded tight in her lap. "The letters," Holmes said abruptly. "You wrote them yourself." Miss Harcourt's head snapped up, her face paling to the shade of parchment. I beg your pardon." The handwriting was disguised, yes, but imperfectly. The slight slant in the second letter, the habitual way you form your capital A, identical to the note you left for Lady Agatha just this morning regarding the morning room curtains. She stared at him, speechless. "Your motive, however, interests me far more," Holmes continued. "It was no common fraud, no attempt at theft. You wished to frighten Lady Agatha into parting with the pearl altogether." Miss Harcourt's breath quickened. "I only wanted to protect her, and myself." "You believe in the curse," I said softly. Her trembling fingers reached for the pendant at her throat. "I have reason to." Holmes gave the faintest nod. "Fear, Miss Harcourt, is a poor forger of letters, but an excellent forger of ghosts." With a sigh that seemed to release some long-held burden, Miss Harcourt began to speak. "My brother, Michael, visited Deverell House some years ago, before Lady Agatha's husband passed. One evening, curious about the jewel's infamous reputation, he asked to see the pearl himself. He held it in his hand only for a moment." Her voice faltered. "The next morning," she continued, "he was found drowned, his body washed ashore not a mile from this very house. No one could explain how he came to be at the water's edge." "An unfortunate accident," I said gently. "A curse," Miss Harcourt whispered. "From that day forward, I knew the pearl was evil. When I saw Lady Agatha's growing attachment to it, her refusal to part with it even after those letters, I thought, if I could convince her that the sea itself was reclaiming the jewel, she would let it go." Holmes steepled his fingers. "A tragic tale, Miss Harcourt. And yet, superstition often blinds us to simpler truths." Her eyes brimmed with unshed tears. "Do you not believe it, Mr. Holmes, after all you've seen?" Holmes's smile was faint. "I believe in causes, not curses, and this cause lies much closer to home." "Closer to home indeed," said Holmes, rising abruptly and beckoning us to follow. "There is another who believes in ghosts, though she would deny it before her own reflection." He led us to Lady Agatha's sitting room, where the elderly woman dozed uneasily by the fire. Holmes placed a gentle hand upon her shoulder, and her eyes flickered open. "Lady Agatha," he said softly, "there is no need for further charade. You may safely produce the pearl." She blanched. "What do you mean?" "It was stolen." Holmes shook his head. "It was hidden, by your own hand." "Preposterous!" she cried, though her voice lacked conviction. "The smudges of ash upon your gloves when you received us yesterday," Holmes said. "The lock of the jewel case unmarked by any instrument, and the faint indentation in the velvet, as though the pearl had been removed and replaced several times before its final disappearance." Her shoulders sagged. "I could not bear to part with it, nor to keep it. I thought if I hid it, perhaps his spirit would rest. Perhaps the hand of the sea would stop reaching for me." Holmes inclined his head. "And so you hid it, not from thieves, but from yourself." As we returned to our room, Holmes paused at the window, gazing out toward the mist-shrouded harbour. "This house," he said quietly, "is a perfect crucible for fear. Old walls, older stories, and minds trained from childhood to believe that the sea remembers." "You think it was all fear then?" I asked. "Fear, and fear's more dangerous cousin, imagination." I considered this. "And yet, Holmes, the pearl is gone." "Quite so," he said, his gaze sharpening. "Which tells me that while Lady Agatha played at ghosts, there was another who took full advantage of the charade." "And Miss Harcourt?" "A victim of her own heart," Holmes said. "She believed she was saving Lady Agatha, when in fact she was merely dressing the old fear in fresh clothes." The room grew quiet, save for the distant sound of the tide. "Ghosts and pearls, Watson," Holmes said at last. "One is made from layers of fear, the other from layers of grit. Between them, you will often find nothing but a clever thief." With that, he turned back toward his papers, leaving me to puzzle out just who that thief might be. For all the confessions laid bare in that dim parlour, Holmes's restlessness did not abate. He stood by the hearth, his gaze fixed not upon Lady Agatha or Miss Harcourt, but upon some distant point known only to himself. "There is a gap," he said suddenly, "an absence where a presence should be." I confess I was at a loss. "Surely, Holmes, the matter is clear. Miss Harcourt's letters, Lady Agatha's fear. Between them, the pearl had no need for an external hand." Holmes gave a faint smile. "And yet, Watson, fear alone does not track mud across a carpet, nor does it leave footprints by an unopened window." I frowned. "You suspect someone else was here?" "Suspect?" Holmes echoed. "No, my dear fellow, I am quite certain." With that, he crossed to the window, his fingers running along the sill with the gentle care of a man reading a message left only for him. Holmes's fingers paused, then plucked something thin and dark from the corner of the sash. He held it up for my inspection, a slender strand of blackened seaweed, tangled and brittle with dried salt. "Curious, is it not?" Holmes said, his voice light. "A house that locks its windows against the night, and yet the sea deposits its calling card upon the very sill." "But how?" I began. Holmes twirled the seaweed between thumb and forefinger. "Consider, Watson, the window itself was found secured, yet this fragment could only have entered if the window had been opened, if only briefly. But the servants are innocent of this particular intrusion." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "The footprint I observed earlier near the terrace bore traces of brine, a mark inconsistent with anyone living within the house. Our visitor came from the water's edge." The thought sent a chill through me. Then the pearl was not only hidden, it was hunted. Holmes nodded. A hunter who knew the house, knew the legends, and knew precisely when to strike. "Who?" I asked. But Holmes only tucked the seaweed into his pocket and reached for his coat. We stepped into the night air, and Holmes stood silently for a moment, his face lifted to the wind. "Easterly," he muttered. "A mild breeze, carrying the scent of the tide straight to Lady Agatha's windows." I knew better than to interrupt such calculations. Holmes walked to the garden wall and knelt briefly, fingers brushing the earth, then examining the dampness upon his glove. "He came wet," Holmes said at last, "soaked through, if I am any judge." "From the docks?" I asked. "Or from something afloat upon them," Holmes replied. "A man who arrives dripping with seawater, tracks it across the terrace, and leaves a strand of seaweed as his signature. Such a man did not come by carriage." "Then who is he?" Holmes smiled. "He is, as yet, only a silhouette. But silhouettes have a habit of stepping into the light, given proper encouragement." The shift in Holmes's manner, from detached curiosity to focused intent, unsettled me more than I cared to admit. What had begun as an eccentric household mystery, little more than a superstition entangling a string of unfortunate coincidences, had taken on a darker tone. "Holmes," I said quietly, "do you believe this man, whoever he is, might do harm?" Holmes's expression was unreadable. "A pearl, Watson, is not merely a trinket. It is currency in its most portable form. Men have killed for less." I felt a prickle at the back of my neck. But if the pearl was hidden, and only Lady Agatha knew where, then logic demands that someone else knew, or guessed, or forced the knowledge from another. Holmes glanced toward the house. "That pearl has been spoken of in whispers for generations. I dare say some of those whispers drifted further than Lady Agatha intended." Holmes stood suddenly, brushing the dirt from his hands. "Come, Watson. If our guest is still watching, and I suspect he is, let us provide him the very news he longs to hear." "What news?" "That the pearl has been found, of course," Holmes said. and that it shall be displayed once more in pride of place. But it has not. Holmes raised a hand, cutting off my protest. Truth, Watson, is a delicate creature. Sometimes, to catch a fish, one must cast an illusion instead of a line. I followed him back into the house, where he instructed Lady Agatha to announce, through her most talkative servant, that the pearl had been miraculously recovered, discovered tucked beneath a loose floorboard in her late husband's study. The story would spread faster than fire among the harbour folk, Holmes assured me. And when the thief hears of this? I asked. Holmes smiled. He will come to claim his prize, and when he does, I shall be waiting. I could not suppress a shiver. For all Holmes's brilliance, there were times, like this, when his calm certainty made the hairs on my neck stand on end. True to his promise, Holmes lost no time in setting his trap. By the following morning, the house was abuzz with a carefully planted rumour that the pearl had been miraculously found beneath a loose floorboard in Sir Jasper Street, Claire's old study. The story, passed from servant to servant with suitable embellishment, soon found its way beyond the garden wall, filtering into the taverns and alleys that lined the harbour. Holmes, though outwardly indifferent, listened keenly as each retelling drifted back to us, carried on the tide of gossip. Now, Watson, he said as we stood upon the terrace that evening, the stage is set, and all we require is an audience of one. But who, Holmes? I asked. Miss Harcourt, Lady Agatha, even the servants, none had reason to spread word so quickly. Holmes gave a thin smile. The guilty always listen hardest, my dear Watson. Our thief will hear it soon enough. As night fell, Holmes made only one request, that Lady Agatha leave the pearl's supposed hiding place untouched and retire early. If our visitor believes the prize is his for the taking, Holmes said softly, he will come to claim it. And so, shortly before midnight, Holmes and I took up our station in the garden. The mist lay thick upon the lawn, curling low along the ground, muffling every sound but the soft lapping of the tide beyond the garden wall. Holmes had selected our hiding place with his usual precision, a narrow alcove beneath the parlour's bay window, affording a clear view of both terrace and lawn. We stood in silence, breath clouding faintly in the cold air. Holmes's profile, sharp and unmoving, might have been carved from stone. Time crept past in damp increments. I confess my nerves began to fray, for there is something peculiarly unsettling about watching for a figure you cannot see, knowing they may be watching you in return. Suddenly, Holmes's hand closed around my wrist with such force that I started. He gave a single imperceptible nod toward the garden path. There, emerging from the mist, came a shadowed form, moving with the slow, deliberate caution of a man intimately familiar with the ground beneath his feet. There, Watson, Holmes whispered. Our guest has arrived. Even in the dim light, I could see the gleam of wet oilskin, the unmistakable garb of a fisherman. The figure advanced, pausing briefly at the edge of the terrace before moving toward the study window. Holmes's grip upon my arm tightened, though he made no move to confront the man. Not yet. As the figure drew closer, the features of his slicker became clearer. Worn, salt-stiffened fabric, its seams repaired with mismatched thread. The hat, pulled low over his brow, bore the unmistakable weathering of years spent braving storms at sea. Holmes exhaled softly. Observe the gait, Watson. Cautious but confident. This man has walked these grounds before. Before I could respond, the intruder reached the window and began working the latch with the ease of someone unlocking a familiar door. The window slid up silently, and the man began to climb inside. Holmes stepped forward. I would not advise that, he said calmly. The figure froze, half inside the room, half out. Slowly, he turned, and as the mist shifted, the lamplight caught his face, a face lined with salt and age, but unmistakable. Good Lord, I whispered. It's James Edgerton, the housekeeper's son. But he drowned years ago, I added. Apparently not, Holmes said. James Edgerton stood, his soaked slicker gleaming faintly, the expression on his face a curious mixture of defiance and fear. "You are expected," said Holmes dryly, though I must admit the resurrection was a pleasant surprise. The man's mouth twisted into something like a smile, though there was no humor in it. "You've no right," he muttered. "That pearl belongs to my family." "Indeed," said Holmes. "And how do you justify such a claim?" "My father salvaged it from the wreck, risked his life to bring it up," Egerton said bitterly. "It was ours by right, until Sir Jasper paid him a pittance to part with it." "And so you faked your death," Holmes observed, "vanishing into the docks, waiting for the day you could take it back." Egerton's hand curled into a fist. "That pearl's cursed. It's brought nothing but misery to every hand that's held it, but that doesn't mean it should rest with them. It's ours by blood." Holmes regarded him for a moment, then nodded slightly. "The sea," he said, "has many hands, but none more tenacious than those who know its depths." Before I could comprehend his meaning, Holmes raised his voice. "I believe you may step forward now, Inspector." From the shadows, Inspector Lestrade emerged, notebook in hand, his usual air of officious satisfaction firmly in place. "Well done, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade. "You always did have a taste for drama." The moment Inspector Lestrade stepped into view, the fight seemed to drain from James Egerton's posture. His hands, still damp from his midnight trespass, hung loosely at his sides. "You have no right to call it theft," he said at last, his voice hoarse. "That pearl never belonged to Lady Agatha, nor to her husband. It belonged to my father, and to his father before him." Holmes's expression remained impassive. "A curious claim," he said, "considering the pearl was purchased lawfully at auction." Egerton's lip curled. "Purchased from men who had no right to sell it. My father salvaged that pearl from the wreck of the La Fortuna, off the Cornish coast. He risked his life to bring it up from the sea floor, only to have it taken from him through trickery and lies. And you," Holmes said softly, "chose to reclaim it through theft and deception." "What would you have me do?" Egerton demanded. "The sea gave it to us. That pearl is soaked in my family's blood." Holmes gave a faint smile. "Blood, I have often observed, is a poor legal argument." Before Egerton could reply, a faint rustling from the garden path drew all eyes toward the hedge. Holmes's smile sharpened. "Ah," he said, "and here comes the second act." From the mist emerged a second figure, shorter, broader, and wrapped in a coat far too fine for any local fisherman. Even before he stepped into the light, I saw Holmes's eyes narrow in recognition. "Mr. Hargreaves," Holmes said cheerfully, "or do you still prefer the alias Captain Black?" The man froze mid-step, then let out a low curse. "Holmes," he muttered, "should have known." Lestrade's eyebrows rose. "Another customer, is it?" "Indeed," said Holmes. "Mr. Hargreaves and I last crossed paths during the affair of the Plymouth opium den, if you recall, Watson." I most certainly did. Hargreaves had been a smuggler of no small reputation, known for his ingenuity in evading both customs officers and common sense. "And what brings you here tonight?" Holmes asked. "The same reason as him." Hargreaves jerked his thumb at Egerton. "Word travels fast when a prize like the Black Pearl turns up." Holmes's smile was almost affectionate. "One should always beware of rumours, Mr. Hargreaves. They tend to be salted with imagination." Hargreaves wiped his sleeve across his brow, the night's mist clinging to his coat like guilt. "I followed the old stories," he said, "about the pearl and the wreck and the curse. When I heard it had turned up again, I knew it would be worth a fortune to the right buyer, curse or no curse." "Did you intend to negotiate with Lady Agatha?" Holmes inquired. Hargreaves snorted. "Hardly. I planned to slip in, lift it quietly, and be halfway to France before anyone missed it. Never expected anyone else would have the same idea." Egerton glared at him. "That pearl isn't for sale." "Everything's for sale," Hargreaves sneered, "if you find the right fool to buy it." Holmes raised a hand. "Gentlemen, as diverting as this exchange is, I fear the matter has already been settled." He reached into his coat and withdrew the strand of seaweed, holding it up between forefinger and thumb. Mr. Egerton left this calling card at the window, but the footprints on the terrace, those belonged to Mr. Hargreaves. 2 hunters, following the same trail, each unaware of the other. A most fortunate collision, from my perspective. Lestrade cleared his throat. Shall I? Holmes gestured elegantly. By all means. Lestrade stepped forward with the air of a man enjoying his role immensely. James Egerton, alias the Drowned Man, and William Hargreaves, alias Captain Black, I believe you both will find lodgings in London far less accommodating than this garden. Egerton offered no resistance. His fight extinguished the moment Holmes had unravelled his tale. Hargreaves, on the other hand, muttered a string of low profanities before Holmes silenced him with a raised brow. You may save your breath, Holmes said. The pearl itself remains unfound, but that is of little consequence. Theft and attempted burglary will suffice. As Lestrade led them both toward the gate, I shook my head in wonder. 2 men, each believing themselves the only thief, I said. And yet neither realized they were both dancing to your tune. Holmes's smile was almost imperceptible. There are few pleasures, my dear Watson, greater than watching a net draw itself closed. As the garden emptied and silence fell once more, I could not help but voice my admiration. You knew, Holmes. From the moment we arrived, didn't you? Holmes's gaze drifted toward the darkened sea. I knew the legend would draw attention. That was inevitable. But I confess, I did not anticipate 2 ghosts rising from the same tide. And the pearl? I asked. Holmes shrugged. It was never about the pearl, Watson. It was about the human condition, greed, guilt, and the peculiar hold that legend has upon the mind. I shook my head. One day, Holmes, you must explain to me how you see these things so clearly. He clapped a hand upon my shoulder. If I did, my dear fellow, you would cease to find me so interesting. As we returned to the house, Holmes paused at the threshold, his hand resting briefly upon the weathered wood. You see, Watson, he said softly, the thrill lies not in the applause, nor even in the capture itself. Then where? I asked. He turned that keen, unflinching gaze upon me. In the moment when order emerges from chaos, when the last piece slides into place and the world makes sense again. There was, for just a heartbeat, something almost wistful in his tone, a rare glimpse of the man behind the machine. Come, he said briskly. We have a pearl to locate, and I believe Lady Agatha's chimney flue deserves our attention. And if the pearl is never found? Then the story becomes richer still, Holmes replied. After all, what is a legend without a final mystery? With that, he stepped inside, leaving me, as ever, scrambling to catch up. It was a relief, after the damp garden, the double arrest, and the murky tale of curses and smugglers, to find ourselves once more before the fire at 221B Baker Street. The lamplight cast familiar shadows across the room, and Holmes had taken his habitual seat, long legs stretched toward the hearth, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Now, Holmes, I began, eager as always to see the case unfolded in full. I confess there are still several threads left dangling in my mind. Holmes regarded me with a faint smile. A necessary condition of my methods, Watson. You must allow me to weave the pattern before I display the tapestry. He reached for his pipe, tapping it idly against the arm of his chair. You have all the facts, my dear fellow. I merely connected them in the order nature intended. Then you might enlighten me as to how nature intended them to be connected. He waved his hand toward the sideboard where Mrs. Hudson had set a fresh pot of tea. Pour me a cup, and I shall oblige you with the tale, from haunting to hoax, and all the fools and phantoms in between. It begins, as so many cases do, Holmes said, with a fearsome imagination left unchecked by reason. Lady Agatha, already steeped in superstition, had convinced herself that her late husband's spirit clung to the black pearl, as possessive in death as he had been in life. Surely not, I said. Even for a woman of delicate nerves, such a notion was not born from thin air, Holmes interrupted. Remember, she lived among sailors and dockmen, men for whom the sea is both master and myth. Legends cling to such places like barnacles to a hull. So she staged the theft herself? Precisely, Holmes confirmed. She removed the pearl from its case, hid it somewhere within the house, and spread word of the theft in hopes that I, with my stubborn refusal to believe in ghosts, would dispel her phantoms for good. And the threatening letters? Ah, said Holmes, those were a second hand at work, though Lady Agatha knew nothing of them. The hoax, you see, took on a life of its own. When fear blooms in one heart, it often spreads its pollen to others. He drew deeply on his pipe. Enter Miss Genevieve Harcourt. Holmes settled deeper into his chair, the flicker of firelight dancing in his eyes. Miss Harcourt, he said, was a woman driven not by greed, but by terror. You observed her trembling hands, her anxious glances. She was haunted not by ghosts, but by memory. I leaned forward. Her brother, the one who drowned. Precisely, said Holmes. The pearl, you see, had passed through his hands before his death. To Miss Harcourt, the two events were inseparable. The pearl itself became an omen of doom. But why send the notes? Holmes smiled faintly. What would you do, Watson, if you feared for someone's life and they refused to heed your warning? You would escalate, dramatize, even invent horrors if you thought it would save them. You mean she believed the curse was real? As surely as you believe in my methods, Holmes said. The letters were her attempt to frighten Lady Agatha into parting with the pearl entirely. She hoped, through fear, to save them both. I shook my head in amazement. So the haunting was a hoax, but the fear was genuine. Holmes raised his cup. Fear, my dear Watson, is often the most genuine thing of all. Holmes set his cup aside, his gaze drifting toward the ceiling, that faraway look I knew so well. Of course, he said, the truth always leaves its fingerprints, no matter how carefully concealed. I frowned. I still failed to see how you knew so much the moment Miss Harcourt entered the room. Holmes smiled. Consider her gloves, Watson. They were too large for her hands, a curious choice for a woman of refinement. I did notice that, I said. Yet you missed the ink smudge on her palm, Holmes continued. Fresh ink, and the faint scent of iodine beneath it, suggesting hasty scrubbing. She had, quite recently, been writing with deliberate concealment. And the rawness at her wrist? Holmes's smile sharpened. Another sign of hasty action. When one slips a glove onto damp skin recently washed in some agitation, it leaves a telltale irritation. I shook my head. All that, from a pair of gloves and a smudge of ink. Holmes waved his hand dismissively. The gloves were merely the curtain, Watson. The ink was the actor peeking through it. He leaned back, steepling his fingers once more. Every story, after all, begins with a hand, and in this case, it was Miss Harcourt's own. Holmes leaned back, fingers steepled once more, his gaze fixed upon the ceiling as though reading his deductions from some invisible text. You see, Watson, he began, the pearl's disappearance was meant to appear supernatural, a ghostly hand reaching from beyond the veil. Lady Agatha and Miss Harcourt, each in her own way, contributed to that illusion. Yet the truth, as always, left footprints. I shifted forward. The seaweed, I said. Precisely, Holmes nodded. A fragment of black seaweed, caught in the window sash, dried and curling from exposure to the room's warmth. Seaweed does not simply fly into second-story windows, particularly when the tide is low. And the salt water. On the latch itself, Holmes confirmed. It formed a faint crust, almost invisible save under close examination. That single clue dispelled all talk of phantoms, for only living hands, wet from the sea, could have left such a trace. But neither Lady Agatha nor Miss Harcourt went near the window, I said. Correct, said Holmes. Neither expected that someone beyond the house had also set his sights upon the pearl. Their private fears had drawn a circle around the mystery. But greed, my dear Watson, knows no such boundaries. Holmes tapped the stem of his pipe thoughtfully against his knee. It is a curious thing, he mused, how often the same object inspires identical desires in men who have never met. I frowned. You mean the housekeeper's son and the smuggler? Indeed, Holmes said. James Egerton, long thought drowned, knew of the pearl's arrival at St. Clair House. To him, it was not merely a bauble, but a birthright, salvaged by his father, unjustly taken and now ripe for reclaiming. And the smuggler? Holmes smiled faintly. William Hargreaves, a man whose livelihood depends on knowing which treasures pass through which hands along the coast. A pearl so steeped in legend would attract precisely the sort of buyer he caters to. Men with more money than sense, eager to own a cursed relic. But neither knew the other was involved. Holmes shook his head. Each believed himself the sole hunter. Egerton thought only of family honour, while Hargreaves followed the scent of profit. Their mutual ignorance was the very thing that guaranteed their collision, and ensured that my net caught them both. I could not suppress a smile. A double twist, Holmes. He returned my smile, and doubly satisfying. Holmes rose and paced slowly before the fire, retracing the steps of his trap. By spreading word of the pearl's recovery, I merely offered bait suited to both appetites, he said. Egerton came for justice, Hargreaves for wealth. Neither anticipated the other. It was remarkable, I admitted, to watch them practically stumble over one another at the window. A rare moment when the truth exceeds one's expectations, Holmes agreed. Had they not crossed paths, it might have taken far longer to resolve matters. But greed, Watson, is an impatient vice. And Lestrade? I asked. Holmes gave a brief smile. Forewarned is forearmed. I invited our good inspector to wait in the garden well in advance. Once the players revealed themselves, the curtain fell swiftly. I shook my head in wonder. You knew, from the moment you saw that seaweed, that it was no ghost at work. My dear Watson, Holmes said, I have yet to meet a ghost with muddy boots and an appetite for pearls. I could no longer contain my exasperation. Holmes, I said, why must you always leave me to stumble in the dark until the very end? He glanced at me, the barest twinkle in his eye. You do yourself a disservice, my dear fellow. You stumbled, yes, but in precisely the right direction. Only because you tugged the string behind me, I retorted. Consider it an exercise in trust, Holmes said. What sport would there be if I laid out the solution in the first act? Sport, I cried. It was no sport to me, I assure you. And yet, he said softly, you always return for the next round. I sighed. More fool I suppose. Not at all, Holmes said. You are the necessary counterweight, Watson. Without your warmth, my methods would seem cold indeed. It was a rare moment of sentiment from Holmes, so rare, in fact, that I scarcely knew how to respond. Well, I said at last, next time, a hint would not go amiss. Holmes's smile was thoroughly mischievous. And rob you of the thrill? Perish the thought. Holmes returned to his chair, gazing into the fire with a look I had come to recognize. The quiet satisfaction of a puzzle solved, yet mingled with a faint melancholy that the game was already over. The black pearl, he said softly, was cursed, but not by any supernatural force. Its curse was far more common, the curse of rarity. I frowned. I'm not sure I follow. Holmes gestured lightly. Objects which pass through too many hands, each coveting it more than the last. They acquire a certain gravity, Watson. Not mystical, but psychological. Men project their desires, their fears, even their superstitions upon it, until the object itself seems almost alive. So the curse is nothing but human folly, I said. Precisely. And yet, I said, it left a trail of death and deception behind it. Holmes nodded. The most dangerous objects are those onto which men hang their dreams, for they will kill to possess them and die before they let them go. For a time we sat in silence, the fire crackling softly between us. Holmes reached for his pipe, packing it with his customary precision. "And the pearl itself?" I asked. Holmes gave a theatrical shrug. "Still missing, I expect. Perhaps Lady Agatha truly did misplace it, or perhaps it will turn up years hence in the pocket of a gardener who mistook it for a particularly fine marble." I laughed. "And the curse?" Holmes's smile was pure mischief. "Ah, the curse. I can only assume its true malevolence lay in its most egregious flaw." "And what was that?" Holmes struck a match, the flame dancing briefly in the dim room. "The alarming dullness of its original setting," he said. I could not help but chuckle, though it was precisely the sort of observation that made Holmes so infuriatingly himself. "Holmes," I said, "you are incorrigible." He exhaled a stream of smoke, his smile faint but contented. "And you, Watson, are indispensable." With that, he returned to his silence, the Black Pearl of Taranto relegated, like so many others, to the crowded shelves of our shared memory. The hour had grown late when Holmes and I found ourselves alone at last, seated once more before the familiar hearth at Baker Street. The tumult of the evening, arrests, confessions, and unravelled plots, had settled into the comforting silence known only to those who have, for the moment, laid down their burdens. Between us, the decanter stood half empty, and our glasses reflected the flicker of the flames. Holmes, his long limbs sprawled in his customary fashion, seemed at ease, though I knew his mind rarely ceased its quiet revolutions. I raised my glass. "To the Black Pearl of Taranto," I said. "May it bring no further calamity to those foolish enough to covet it." Holmes's smile was faint. "Or," he replied, "may it bring them precisely the calamity they deserve." With that, we drank, to fortune, folly, and the countless mysteries yet to come. As the hour crept toward midnight, I found my gaze drifting toward the mantel, where the pearl had been placed upon our return. Its dark surface caught the firelight, glinting faintly, an object of singular beauty and, to my mind, undeniable menace. "Holmes," I said quietly, "despite your explanations, I cannot entirely shake the feeling that there is something wrong about that pearl." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "Superstition, Watson? I had thought better of you." "And yet," I persisted, "there is a pattern, is there not? Every hand that touches it seems to come to misfortune." "A pattern," Holmes said, "born entirely of human folly." "Perhaps," I admitted. "But does it not seem that certain objects carry misfortune with them, whether by nature or by reputation?" Holmes sipped his drink, but offered no immediate reply. It was then, at the very moment Holmes opened his mouth to offer some scathing rebuttal, that a sharp, sudden crack rang out from the mantelpiece. Both of us started, my glass sloshing against my fingers. Holmes rose in a single fluid motion and crossed to the mantel, where the pearl lay. It had split, cleanly and precisely, the fracture running through its dark heart like a knife wound. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It was, I am not ashamed to confess, an unsettling sight. "Curious," Holmes murmured. "A flaw in the nacre, undoubtedly, but an opportune one, from your perspective." I swallowed. "Even you must admit the timing is remarkable." Holmes's only reply was a soft "humph" before returning to his chair. For the briefest instant, no more than the space between two heartbeats, I saw something pass across Holmes's face. It was not fear, precisely, nor even belief, but a flicker of something dangerously close to doubt. He masked it quickly, of course. Sherlock Holmes could no more confess to uncertainty than a surgeon could confess to trembling hands. But I had seen it, and knowing Holmes as I did, the sight of it unsettled me more than any crack or curse could have. "Perhaps," he said quietly, Some objects do cling to their history after all. But Holmes was not a man to dwell on shadows. Within moments the faint cloud passed from his brow, and his smile, sardonic and self-assured, returned. "Fortunately, Watson," he said, "our next engagement promises no such melodrama. No pearls, no phantoms, no curses. A perfectly sensible case." I raised an eyebrow. "Sensible, you say?" "A missing manuscript," Holmes said, with the air of a man reciting a nursery rhyme, "and a vanished opera singer, the work of an afternoon." "I shall believe that when I see it," I said. "Then you will have your opportunity," Holmes replied, "for the messenger arrives at 10. With that, he lifted his glass once more, and we drank, to manuscripts, to music, and to the certain knowledge that, in Sherlock Holmes's world, no case was ever truly sensible. The fire had dwindled to a soft glow, and the cracked pearl still rested on the mantelpiece, a silent witness to the tale it had woven around itself. Holmes leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the walls of Baker Street, as though seeing not the room, but the long, twisting chain of greed, superstition, and human folly that the black pearl had dragged behind it. "You see, Watson," he said at last, "the greatest mysteries are seldom born from brilliance. They grow instead from fear and from the quiet lies people tell themselves when the truth feels too heavy to bear." He gestured toward the broken pearl. "Lady Agatha feared ghosts, Miss Harcourt feared curses, and the thieves feared being cheated of what they imagined was their rightful prize. Not one of them saw the pearl for what it truly was, a mere object, incapable of malice. And yet," I said softly, "it still managed to ruin lives." Holmes's smile was faint, almost pitying. "No, my dear Watson, it was not the pearl that ruined them. It was their belief in its power." Holmes tapped his fingers against the arm of his chair, eyes glinting with quiet amusement. "Which raises a question, Watson, and one I pose to our more perceptive readers as well." He turned slightly toward me, and I knew by that familiar half-smile that he was setting a trap of his own. "In the tangled affair of the Black Pearl, who made the greatest mistake? Was it Lady Agatha, for believing in ghosts? Miss Harcourt, for hiding the truth? Or the thieves, for trusting a legend over logic?" I must confess, I could not answer him at once. And perhaps you, dear reader, will have sharper insight than I. Share your thoughts below and tell us, whose mistake proved the most fatal? And if you delight in unravelling such curious cases alongside Holmes and myself, be sure to subscribe for more mysteries. For even now, the next riddle knocks upon our door, and I assure you, we shall need all the help we can get. After all, as Holmes himself once said, the world is full of obvious things which nobody by any chance ever observes.